Today we're going to do an in-depth look at the new Potensic Atom 2. And yes, I did do a test and review on this, and I will put that link up here if you didn't happen to see that video, but that was more of a test and review. This is going to be more of an in-depth tutorial. So with that, let's talk about it. Now, as I mentioned, I am going to go through an in-depth tutorial on all the different bits and bobs, all the functions and features, all the setups and settings. This was one of the longest videos, or I would say probably the longest video that I have ever done. And so that you can get the most out of the drone, I want to go through all the things right from the beginning when you take it out of the box, how you set it up, how you set all your different settings, and then how you're going to use some of the features. Of course, there are going to be some things you're probably going to know or maybe don't want to know as much about. So I will put chapters down here so you can skip forward and backward, and you can come back to it later if you find something that you need more information on. So first, let's take this out of the box and just see what we're talking about. So this is the bag as it comes from Potensic, and everything comes in here in the Fly More kit. Now, I would always recommend that you get the Fly More package. Now, if you happen to get the unit with one battery and no case, this might be a little different to you, but it's always better to get that Fly More package right away, because if you enjoy drone flying at all, you are going to find that one battery is just not enough. You're going to run out of that one battery, and then you're going to be disappointed that you have to wait to charge it to fly it again. Now, one nice thing is that the Atom battery, the Atom 1, and now this is the Atom 2, the Atom 1 batteries will pop right in here and work. They're exactly the same battery. So if you happen to have the first version of the Atom, not the SE or the LT, but the Atom 1 itself, those batteries will drop right in. So if you do get the single battery package, you can use the case from the last one and the batteries, for instance. So just keep that in mind. Laid out in here is going to be the remote, the charger, some extra props and things like that, the power cord, and the drone body itself. Now we're going to pull these out so that we can see those one by one, what they look like. I'm going to start with the remote. So the first thing we're going to notice with the remote is that there's a charging port here, a USB-C, what you're going to plug in to charge the remote itself. So when it comes, it's going to have just a little bit of charge on it, but you're going to want to charge it with the USB-C. Now, there's a big yellow note here, you'll notice. And the reason they have that there is because when you plug in a USB-C cable to charge, if you start putting this antenna up, you're going to break that cable or bend it or something. So there's this big note on it right away that we're going to take off to tell you to make sure that you remove the USB-C cable when you charge before you pop this antenna up. The second thing to note is that the sticks are not permanently mounted. You're going to need to attach those, and they are stored in the bottom here. They just pop out of there and you can screw those on. Now, if you want, you can leave these in the future once you put it in the case, but you risk damaging things by doing that. So you may want to put those back in there for storage. The stick on the left is going to be your up and down, or your raise and lower of the drone, or left and right. It's going to kind of spin the drone left to right. And the right stick then, if you move forward or away from you, it's going to move the drone forward. Moving it back is going to move the drone back. Then if you move it left or right, it's going to take the drone left or right. Not turn, but it's going to take it straight left or right. And on the front of the remote, there are some buttons and dials here. The dials are for the zoom and for the gimbal tilt. The button on the top here is for taking a photograph or starting your video. And then the C1 and the C2 are configurable buttons, which are really quite nice. There's a lot of things you can do with that. And I'll put that up here so you can see all the different configurations. And I'll show one of these because we are going to use the C1 and the C2 button for different functions later on. Now on the top of the drone is two buttons. There is a power button here, which you press and hold will turn the remote on. And then there is a return to home button here. So if you push that, if you're going to do the return to home function, we'll do that a little bit later. Now to connect the remote to your tablet, you're going to use one of these little USB-C cables. And there's two ends on it. The one end is kind of just a regular L. The other side is kind of an angled L as well, but there's this little extra piece on it. Now that's going to be the end that goes into the front of the remote here so that you can access it. So you can go ahead, plug that one in. You can see how nice and flush that fits in. You can press this one in there just so it's kind of out of your way a little bit. Then the other end will go into your device on the end. You spread the remote apart, and your device will drop straight in. So the last thing that's on the remote is that here there are two holes which are threaded 1/4-20 type holes, and that is for screwing in a lanyard. Sometimes the remote's going to get heavy if you hold on to it for a while, or like I like to do is use a tablet, and that will allow you to have a lanyard around your neck connected here so that it's a little easier, give you a little less fatigue. Next in the bag here is the drone body itself. The drone body, first you'll see, comes with this little elastic strap on here, and to be honest, I don't like this strap. I would recommend either being really careful with this or just getting a different one. Many times I don't even use this strap. And the reason I don't like it is the Velcro on here is so strong. And it's really almost to the point to where you're going to damage something if you're pulling around on this and maybe bend or break one of the props. So this is a great idea, but I wish that Velcro were a little bit softer. Now with the drone body itself then, the arms do fold out like this, so you want to unfold all of those. And you'll notice that when it comes, all these props are already installed. Now, even though they're pre-installed, you're going to want to take a little tool that's in here, a little Phillips screwdriver, and just kind of double check and make sure that all those screws are down all the way. That's something you want to do every time before you do a flight. Just make sure that your props are installed good to make sure you don't have one fly off in the middle of a flight somewhere. Next thing that you'll note is that there's a gimbal guard on here. Now, this is the first time we're taking this gimbal guard off, so there'll be one extra piece, and it comes off by pushing here on the bottom, and you pull it off to the front, tip it off. Then you'll notice that there's this little piece of foam, and I would kind of hold on to that gimbal just a little bit so you don't damage the gimbal or stress it. And then you can pull this little piece of foam out of here, and you're going to just hold on to that for later. You won't need it again when you're traveling or when you're putting it away for storage. You can put this gimbal guard back on. Tips into the front first, then snaps down, just like that. On the bottom of this drone, there is your sensors for your optical flow sensors as well. And then there's the power button here. Now we're going to talk about that power button here because I'm going to grab these batteries out, and you'll notice that they're in the tri-charger here. And something you'll note is that there is a red label here on these batteries. And what that's for is when they ship these batteries from the factory, they're going to come with a partial charge on them, and they're in a standby mode. So if you're all excited and you notice that there's a couple of bars of battery on here and you want to go ahead and take it up for a quick flight and you're excited and you put it in, it will give you a prompt and tell you that there's a problem with the battery. That's because to initialize them or pull them out of standby, you need to charge them fully the first time before you fly. There is a USB in the side here. That is not for charging. That is if you want to plug in something like your remote and you want to plug in a USB-A here and then go to a USB-C. It will take power out from this and charge something else, but it will not charge the battery bank. So you're going to need to use this AC power brick here to plug in and charge the batteries. Now, to be honest, first, when I saw this, I was disappointed with the Atom 2. I was hoping they would have like a power delivery USB-C. But then, when I plugged it in to charge it, and I had the batteries at 1 or 2 bars on each battery, it charged all 3 of these within about 55 minutes. So that is really quick to be able to do, and you probably wouldn't be able to do that with a USB connection. So on second thought, that is really nice. If you want to charge all 3, you plug it in with this. It's going to charge really fast. Now, when you put the batteries in, you're going to notice that there's a little wired connection here, and you're going to make sure those line up. And it's really important that there's a little snap that really activates or kind of clicks when you put that in. So when you put it in, you'll notice that it pops out. Because one of the biggest problems that happens is you put it in there and it looks pretty good, but it didn't snap all the way. And it might make an electrical connection and you wouldn't even know that it's a problem until you go to try and fly. And then the electrical connection will get undone and it'll drop out of the sky, or it'll intermittently stop and then it'll start spinning. So you want to make sure every time you put it in there, it clicks, make sure the tab is all the way down so that your battery is seated all the way every single time you put a battery in. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves here, there is also another bag. And in this bag is some additional cables and your spare prop. So keep track of those. You want to make sure you know where those are. As well as in this little bag, there's the Phillips screwdriver I talked about that we'll use to tighten the props if you need to replace them in the future, or just make sure that they're tight. And there's some little extra screws in there because they are tiny. If you're fumbling with them, you might lose them. So they have some extra screws in here as well. In addition, they do have a couple of cables in here. One cable for charging your remote, just like we talked about. This cable will go from here if you want to plug it in and go to your remote so that you can charge the remote and the batteries all at the same time. And then there is another cable. We already pulled out the USB-C to USB-C, but there's also an iOS connector, a lightning type connector to a USB-C as well. So if you need that one's in your kit as well. Now, before we go and fly this drone, before we even turn it on, before we power it up and start connecting it and talking about the app and all that stuff, there's something that's really important that you do, especially here in the US. Now, that is, you have to be qualified to be able to fly a drone. And I know you're probably thinking, if you're a beginner, what do you mean? It's a toy, right? And that's not true. This is considered an aircraft and is governed by the FAA of the United States. Yes, believe it or not, the same people who are in charge of the entire airspace and 747s flying in the sky are also in charge of this drone. Now, one good thing is that this drone is below 250 grams. Now, if you're not familiar with that limit, that's kind of an arbitrary limit that the FAA has put in place, that if it's below 250 grams and you're flying for fun, you can fly as a recreational pilot. Now, what does that mean? First of all, it means that you don't need to go take any big expensive test or training or get a license or anything like that. But it means that you do need to fly for fun. That's the only thing you can do with this is fly for fun. If you bought this to go fly and check somebody's rain gutters out or scan some real estate, or you want to go and do mapping, or you want to take videos of the team for school and post them on a website, you can't do any of that. You can only fly for fun if you're going to fly as a recreational pilot. And the way you do that is first, please go and take the trust test. Now, the trust test is offered by the FAA. It's simple, it's free, it's online, so it's very easy. And believe it or not, there's a lot of really good information in there. So even if you're going to fly recreationally, you must pass the trust test and have a copy of it with you, and you must follow all the other recreational rules. And I happen to do a video on that, and I'll put that link up here so you can go check it out, or bookmark it and can come back and check that at a little time. But regardless, just know you need to be qualified to be able to fly this drone. And the other way you can fly is under Part 107, and sometimes that's called a commercial license. And it's kind of not really truly commercial, but it does allow you to do kind of more commercial-like things in that you do get a certificate at the end. You do have to take a federal test, which is a couple hours, and you do have to pass with a particular grade. And if you don't pass, you don't pass. You have to take it again in the future. But that allows you to make money with your drone if you want to do real estate, take videos of your football team and post them on the Facebook page for your coach. You can do that type of stuff. That's legal then, but it is a little bit more involved. If you're interested in that route, I did work together with Pilot Institute, who is the #1 training institute in the United States. And they do a great training program, which will make it real easy for you. They guarantee you pass or your money back. And I'll put those links in the description so you can go check that. And by using the link that I have or the code that I'll put in the description, you can also get $100 off. So it's actually pretty inexpensive for you. So if that's something you want to do, might want to take a look at that because I think it'll be worth your time. So let's get into loading the app. And you might say, well, where do I even find the app? And it's interesting because Potensic will put that right here on the lid of the box. There's going to be a scan code, and that's going to be the app that you're going to need to use for the Potensic. It happens to be the Potensic Eve app. So once you get the app loaded, the first thing that it's going to want you to do is log in with your username and password. And if it's the first time you're using the app, you're going to have to create an account at Potensic. There's no way you can get around it really. I think you can bypass it the first time, and you can probably do that for like 3 times, but it will limit how high you can fly and how far you can fly. So I would recommend just taking the time, getting yourself an email, getting a password, writing that down so you know what it is, and then log in. Quick tip is to make sure you have a little note somewhere of what that login and password is somewhere so that you can log in if you're not sitting right next to your home office. The first thing that you'll see popping up is you'll see the prompt for buying Potensic Care. This is something that Potensic has just started doing, and this is like an insurance program for you and your drone. So what this means is that if you're out flying and by accident you're learning and you run into something and you damage the drone, you can take this drone and you send it to Potensic, and there's a small fee that goes along with that, and they will send you a completely functional drone. The trick here is that you can only sign up for that within the first 48 hours. So this prompt will keep popping up like you're seeing here. But if you don't do it in the first 48 hours, you can't do it anymore. So you're going to want to know before you log in if it's something you're going to want to do so you don't have to think about it for a couple days. If you're interested in it, just get it right away and be done with it. And something to note as well is that you want to make sure that you always take this gimbal cover off before you turn the drone on. It's something that is easily missed because it's kind of tucked away there really nice. But if you leave that on very often while you start the drone up, you're going to start to stress the gimbal. When you stress the gimbal, then eventually it won't work, and you're going to turn it on and you'll get some error or it won't adjust anymore. So make sure that you make taking this gimbal cover off part of your routine every time that you start up a drone so you save yourself some trouble in the future. Sometimes when you're starting remotes or drones, you short press and then long press and hold. This is not that way. Both of these are going to be a simple long press till it beeps, turn it up, and the gimbal then will initialize. Now, before we go into the Fly Now menu, let's take a look at a couple of the menus. First, up on the upper left is the Smart Transfer button. So the Smart Transfer then is going to allow us to transfer the files from our drone into the phone so that we don't have to worry about hooking up a SD card reader or anything like that, which is the other point, is that on the drone itself, there's a little slot back here right under the battery, which is an SD card slot. And that SD card is what records all of your footage while you're flying the drone. And without that SD card, you will only get low resolution footage to your remote. So you're going to want to make sure that you put an SD card in here. And the maximum size is a 512 gig card. And you're going to want to put in a pretty good card in there. I'll put a couple links in the description for some SanDisk type cards that are really good for drones. They've not failed me very often at all. And you want to slip that in and make sure it's inserted good and formatted before you even turn the drone on. The next thing to note on the remote here is that there's an Academy here, which if you click on that, it is really nice because it's going to give you some tips and tricks on how to go through where everything is and give you a little tutorial on things. If you want to run through there, it is actually pretty good. Also available here is the user manual so that you can open it up and find out any specs or any details as well. But as you flip through this, if you want to know more, you can do QuickShots, you can look at what the home screen is, you can do the different flight modes, you can look at the safety guidelines. There's quite a few things in here to give you some updates. So take some time and kind of walk through these. So again, just so that you can be familiar with the drone and the operation. Now there's a couple things on this front page that I wanted to show as well because I think they're very useful. One is the Find My Drone feature, which if you happen to lose track of your drone and you open this map, it will show you the last known location. Also, if the drone is still powered, and you can click the beep my drone down here in the corner, it will sound a little alarm on the drone, which is really nice. And you can hear what that beep sounds like here. And that will help you identify where it is with an audible signal as well. Now, the second thing that's on here is that if you ever have issues with your drone and Potensic asks you for your logs, here's where you go to that log. And if you click here, you'll see all of your logs. And then if you upload them with the little cloud symbol here, so then if they know what login is yours and you tell them that you've uploaded that file, they will be able to see those logs as well. So if something happened with your drone and you have Potensic here, for instance, and they want to see what happened, this is where you're going to get those logs. So going back to this homepage then, something that I wanted to point out right away is that if it ever asks you for a firmware update, this is where you're going to see it pop up. And it's a really good idea to keep your firmware up to date. So let's go update now. And typically when you do firmware updates, it's going to do the drone and the remote and the app as well. So depending upon what it needs to update, it could do any of those or all three. So you're going to want to make sure that they're all updated every time before you start flying the drone. Now that we have the app loaded and we have our device now plugged into the remote, we're going to turn the drone on because that will allow us to see a little more menus inside of the drones here. So we're going to go ahead and turn this on. There we go. Fly now. If all is well, the remote automatically connects to the drone and we should get an image, a real-time image out of the drone right now. And you can see indeed we do. The drone is producing an image and we're getting it right here in front of us. So one little trick I want to show you as well is that where it shows this take off with caution, there's actually a little quick menu under there. So if you click on that menu, you'll see a little quick pop-up here, and it pops up some of our most used functions like the speed, the different altitude settings and things like that. These are some of the functions you're going to use all the time. Now, don't worry about what's in there yet. We'll go through all those and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Second place is there's some menus. If you go on this right-hand side, up in the upper right, and the first one is this little gimbal looking thing in the upper right here. It just tells you what your gimbal angle is on the gimbal itself. So if you click that and move the gimbal, and let's do that. There we go. You can see that indeed that moves. So it'll just tell you where that gimbal is at a glance. Second one here is the GPS, this little red one right now. And it's red, of course, because we don't have any GPS here in the studio. We don't have line of sight to the satellites. So you can see just by a glance at that one, if you have good satellites. Now, I always like to see 16, 18, 20 type satellites. But of course, your area, it'll depend upon what's strong in your area. The more, the better. Next one is the little radio signal here. Now that's going to be the connection from your remote here to your drone. And this little signal tells you the frequency that it's hopping to connect the two. If you have an awful lot of spikes on this little graph here that show us that we have all kinds of red, you might want to consider a different area so that you don't have interference. And that's how drones end up toilet bowling or getting lost and flying away. So take a look at that once in a while and see if you have a lot of interference before you take off and fly. Next one over here is the battery, and it will tell you things like the return to home time, how long it will be before it forces, and it will try to estimate that once you're in the air. The little icon that is the little film strip looking thing here is kind of just like that. It's going to be for your camera or video type settings. You can flip between camera taking pictures or video and some different shots like a panel shot or night mode. And the little red circle, you'll notice if I change that from a camera to a video mode, you'll notice that the button changes from a red to a white. And if I go back to video, it'll change to a red. This is going to be how you're going to start or stop the video or take a picture. And if you're wondering which picture settings or which video settings you will use, that is down on the bottom of the screen here. Go ahead and click that. Notice that it says, I just clicked on that and it pops up. It says that we're in a 4K 30 mode, 16 by 9, 30 frames per second, 4K. And we can also go into the HDR mode, same place here. Go ahead and change those, whatever makes sense for you. And we're gonna leave it at 4K, 30 frames per second for me. This one little picture here is going to take you to your photo album that's saved on your device. Now the one little camera looking thing there will switch, if you click on that, it will switch between automatic and manual camera settings. So over here on the lower left is also a little area where you can see that there's kind of a map back there. And if you click on it, it will enlarge this area and show you a topographical type view or a satellite view, or you can change it to a street view or whatever you like over here. And if you click on it again, it will take it back to where the view from the camera is now shown on the main screen again. Now also, if you click in the upper right hand corner of this little square, you'll see there's a little plus there. If you click on that, it's going to change to a couple different modes. You notice it's more of an elevation, to where if you tip the drone side to side, you'll see that it shows you that the drone is indeed flying at different angles. So it'll tell you how the angle of the drone is with the horizon, and it will tell you the compass. You can see there's north, south on here. So it will actually tell you the direction of the drone itself, which way it's pointing. So you can flip between and see what makes sense for yourself. So let's dig into the settings and set up our initial settings before we even start to fly. So to do that, we're going to enter the interface like we did before, and we're going to enter these three little dots in the upper right hand corner. We're going to start first with the beginner mode. In the beginner mode, it will adjust some of the settings so that you can't go very far or you can't go very high. Now, it's not a bad idea if you're not that familiar with drones. Start in the beginner mode. It will be a lot easier to fly. It will kind of keep you out of some trouble. And when you're ready, you can take that out of beginner mode just so you can get a little more height and a little more distance. The next setting is the video speed settings, and the video is going to be your slowest, which is going to be a nice, hopefully a cinematic move. The next one being the normal, kind of a medium mode, if you will. And then the sport is going to be really fast. So if you're going to want to speed from one place to another while you're getting some shots, for instance, you might want to go into sport mode just to get you there. And this does move out really quite fast. The next one is the signal loss, and that's going to tell you what it's going to do when it loses the signal. If you get far enough away, you get some interference, something happens and you lose the signal of the drone. Is it going to do an automatic return to home, which is what I suggest? Or is it going to land immediately where it is? If it loses signal, just land? Or is it going to just stop and hover and wait for you to do something? So whatever makes sense for you, but in the beginner mode, I would say put it in the return to home mode as default. So this return to home altitude is one of those that, depending upon where you're flying, you want to make sure that if it doesn't automatic return to home, it's not going to clip into something. So if you put it at 50 feet and you have trees or buildings between you and where the drone is, when it returns to home, it's going to run right into it. There's no obstacle avoidance or anything. So you want to make sure that if it does a return to home, it's going to be high enough to get past any obstacles. So I know 197 feet is fine, but if you do have obstacles, that's where you want to set your height. This dynamic home point is going to tell you where the drone is going to land once you're up in the air. So for instance, you're in a follow mode and you're maybe a quarter mile away from where you started. You're following it on a bike or something. And you want the drone to land where you are if it runs out of battery, rather than going all the way back and trying to land where it took off from. So this is what's going to enable that mode for you. Next one is the silent return, which I always turn on as default. And that just means if it's coming home, it beeps the whole time it's coming home, which is kind of nice, I guess, if you want to know that, but it is kind of loud and obnoxious. So I typically, as a default, I would turn that on. The maximum altitude is like it sounds like. It's going to be the maximum altitude from takeoff level, so from where I am right now, to the maximum altitude that it will go, and it'll stop there. Now, I usually set that below the 400 feet, which is our max altitude here in the US, but sometimes you want to set that a little higher. There are some situations, Part 107, where you can do that. In recreational, you can never do this. So there would be no circumstances ever if you're flying recreational where you set that above 400 feet. So I would set that somewhere below the 400 feet and just leave it there unless you have some special circumstances. Next is the maximum distance. Now you can go quite a ways, and I typically do just beyond my visual line of sight. I know my visual line of sight is even less than the 1,640 feet. So I will set it there and it'll bump into a little kind of a self-imposed maximum distance. The units are going to be what your country specific kind of standard is. In the US, it is the imperial standard. So I'm going to set that so that my distances and my speeds and things show up in feet and miles. The flight safety tips are the little banner that's going to run across the screen. And when we get there, you'll notice it because I leave those on. Not that you need those, but some of those tips are actually relevant. So I leave those on, but you can turn those off here. Now the takeoff with one hand is really interesting in that they did a nice job. It is nice to be able to do that with one hand and take off. There's an also option here for an emergency propeller stop in mid-flight, and you got to be really careful with this. I have it turned off, and I know some people will turn it on because it is a nice emergency mode, and depending upon how comfortable you are with this, you certainly can do this. However, you just don't want to drop it out of the sky and cause damage or hurt somebody. So use that with care. For now, I would leave that off until you're really comfortable with it. Lastly, on this page, we do have the remote ID section, and I did talk about that in the original video, and what that does is allow you to set up your remote ID, even though this is below 250 grams. So if you are Part 107 or you register the drone because you want to, that is really nice to have, so you don't have to stick a module on top of the drone. It is really a nice feature. However, I did find initially it was transmitting all the time. Now, they were supposed to do a firmware upgrade, and we'll test that in a little bit. We'll come back to this. So you'll need to follow the rules of your country, what information you need to populate here. Now, on the calibration page is everything you're going to do to set up your drone so that it can fly correctly, or if you're having some type of issue. The first one you're going to see is the calibration of the compass. Now, we're going to do that because I'm in a different area, so I want to calibrate the compass. So I'll go through it so you can see what that process looks like. So I'm going to do start calibration. So that we're going to spin the drone horizontally until it beeps, or the display tells us to go vertically. Then we're going to go vertical, and then we'll set it down and it will do a little gimbal calibration. Now, we also have gimbal calibration, and that is if your gimbal is kind of going wonky, you can do a calibration. It's going to set on all different sides. You'll start this process. Now, I wouldn't do it unless you have a problem, or unless you're having an issue and you're talking with technical support at Potensic, and they suggest that you do it. Otherwise, I just wouldn't bother doing it because you can screw things up to where you break it if it's not having a problem. Gimbal fine tuning is going to be if you have a horizontal tilt in your horizon all the time. It's always adjusted. You can tweak it there. I've never really, on more of the modern drones, had to do this if there's some offset, but if you do, that's where you would do it. You would just toggle it side to side, and it would kind of give that as your offset. Remote control calibration is if kind of the same thing as the gimbal. If you notice that it's always kind of biasing, or you're having some issues when you do the sticks, you have to push it way far to the right and then just a little bit to the left, something's kind of not right, you can do a calibration on the remote itself. If it's working fine, I wouldn't do it unless Potensic support tells you to go ahead and try that. The last one on here is repairing the drone, and that'll happen, for instance, if you have Potensic Care and you send the drone in because it was damaged and they send you another drone back, you're going to need to repair the remote with the drone itself. So it's just a little process. You go in, it'll tell you push the button underneath, start it, and then push the power button. There's a little sequence once you go through it, and it'll beep and then reconnect the remote to the drone. But again, unless you're having some problem, you shouldn't need to do that. It will automatically resync and repair every single time you turn the drone on, so you should be okay automatically. Next is the control section, and the first one in the control section is the control stick mode, which you can swap the control stick mode so that the left and right sticks, compared to normal, for instance, are the opposite way. My suggestion would be is to just leave that as the default. Next section is a really helpful if you're not sure what all the buttons and things do and you want to go through. It's a little tutorial here, or a little kind of thumbnail of where all the buttons are, what they do, and what all the lights mean. The next page is the button customization, and that is something really nice that Potensic has done, is that for these customizable buttons, C1, C2, you have a huge array of things that you can set these to. You can do multiple presses, you can press and hold, you can have them do all kinds of different things. Now, the defaults are for the C1 and C2 are going to be your gimbal up and down and your speed settings. I'm okay with those right now, so we're not going to set those, but realize that those exist. You can adjust all those if you want. In the control stick sensitivity, this is where you're going to adjust how much movement on the stick correlates to how much movement on the drone. Now, to be honest, these are typically too high for me. I like to have it very smooth so that I can get a really nice cinematic movement when I'm doing any commercial work. I really want to make sure it's nice and slow, because you can always speed your footage up, but if you're too fast, slowing it down doesn't look right. You're going to get motion blur. Sometimes you'll get some jitter based on the frame rates or things, so you're always better going a little slower for longer, and you can always speed it up in post if you want to with no negative consequences. So I'm going to run this down pretty low. I'm going to run both of these down, the pitch roll and the yaw. I'm going to run right down to the bottom, and the up down I'm going to leave alone. We don't need to do anything more with that one. We'll just leave it at that. The next one is the camera pitch angle, and that's just going to flip your gimbal up and down. The next one, the gimbal mode, is stable or FPV. The FPV mode, as the drone pitches around, because it does quite a bit, but we don't really notice it because the gimbal does such a good job. But the gimbal will be locked more to where if your drone pitches, the video will pitch as well. It will keep your gimbal at that same angle. So if you're flying like this, you will actually see the drone pitch, and the video will pitch like that too. So it'll be more like an FPV view. So the next section is going to be for setting up your modes on the camera. Now, you can set this up for auto mode, and again, as a beginner, I would suggest going into auto mode, not going into the manual settings. But if you want to, you can do auto white balance or manual. If you turn the manual on, you'll be able to switch this back and forth, let it go. Next one is the grid line, and I do like having the cross and the square on there, but of course you can choose that or turn all or none of them on, depending upon what your needs are. Next one, your color is going to be your standard or your HDR mode, and the standard is fine. The HDR should bring up shadows and such a little bit if you kind of have some shadowy areas. Now, sequence recording is going to be how long your video is when you're recording. It's going to chop those into some segments based on the size of the video, for instance. So we're just going to leave that auto again as default will be fine. The video codec, you can use 264 or 265. 265 is a little newer codec, a little more efficient, so it will change the size. But you have to be careful because a lot of browsers or a lot of softwares that you use to edit this footage don't have the H.265 native. So you'll just have to make sure it meets your needs or matches the equipment you have to do any post-processing. So the next section is going to be on the SD card. It's a 512 gig maximum SD card that you can put in. Just showing you how much we have left of what we've already recorded. And it is always suggested, even if you format the SD card outside in a computer or something, is to format it in the drone itself just to make sure it's the best compatibility you can. So as long as we're here, I'm gonna go ahead and format that so you see what it looks like. There we go, and that is good. And we're gonna leave the file name just the default. Auto center target is going to be, if you're doing a follow mode, for instance, do you want to try to keep the drone in the center of the target? Or as it's going along, you'll keep it in frame, but not try as hard to keep it right smack in the center. So I do like to have it in the center to try because it'll be enough time where it'll be off. So I'll let it try to keep us in the center as much as it can. Defog mode is an interesting mode because initially I thought that the defog was a mode that if it was cool and your lens were fogged up, that would actually apply like a little heater or something to try to defog the lens. And that's kind of not what it is. It's maybe a little misleading in what they show because the defog mode is if you're a little hazy or foggy out and you turn that defog mode on, it actually just changes the settings of the camera to a little brighter and a little sharper, a little more vivid to try to make your foggy footage look a little more crisp and a little more saturation or contrast through the fog. So it's just going to change your camera settings, not actually try to do anything with defogging the lens. The video subtitles are going to be what's on your video when you store the video and you have them on your device here. So I don't really care to have the subtitles on my video, so I'm going to go ahead and flip that off as a default. Next one is the video transmission. You know, in the initial part when we talked about that video transmission, we saw a little screen of that, but this will tell us where that it sees noise in our surrounding area, so that if we're flying, we might have a problem with the signal transmission. So it's constantly hopping this frequency a little bit to try to stay away from a noisy area. Know if we do find some areas that are noisy, that we'll probably want to try a different area or do something to minimize that noise. Last section in our setup here is going to be the about section, and this is going to be the data of the drone. First one is going to be the model of the drone, going to give you serial numbers and things like that. So if you want to register the drone, that's where you're going to find the information of the drone and the remote serial number and things like that. The next one is the firmware version, and we did update the firmware before we went out today. There was an update, so I want to see if some of the things we were thinking they were going to update in the next firmware update, if they truly got that. But it is early because, again, this is just an early production model, so they may not have all the firmware updates in it. But if they do have firmware updates, or they ask you at the Potensic Care what firmware version you want, this is where you're going to find all the versions for the firmware itself. Same as the app here as well. You're going to be able to see the version of the app in case, again, they want you to update the app or make sure what version you have. And the flight safety data, which is going to be resident in the drone. And that's going to be for the geofencing type safety information to tell you you can fly there or you have a geo zone warning, for instance. So that's where this is going to come from, is the version of this map. So that is all of our setup we're going to do. And before we get into flying yet, remember I told you there was this quick little menu up underneath the takeoff here? You see that there is some of those settings we just saw in the other menus up here, and it's kind of like a little quick spot, and it shows you the return to home altitude and maximum altitude, the drone remote controller return to home. These are just kind of some of your quick settings that are right here. So if you want to change some of those, since those are kind of the really important or the ones you use all the time, just go ahead and click here and you won't have to plop through your menu. So that is a really nice thing that Potensic has done. So now that we have all the parameters set to what we want, we can take off. And there's a few ways we can do that. You can first take the sticks down and in, and that will start the motors on the drone. Then you can use the left stick up to change the altitude, and you can lift it off the ground that way. Second way is you can do the one-handed launch that we talked about by holding in the C1 button, pulling the stick down, and then letting the stick go, and it will launch automatically from there. The third way is you can actually press on the remote itself, and you'll see that it has a swipe mode. Yeah, any one of those will work depending on your situation. If you want to do it from hand, a one button, sticks, whatever you're comfortable with, all of them will work. So in this case, let's just use the app to push and swipe the drone, and we will take off. So the drone did take off here, and we are sitting here hovering, and it is very nice and stable. No worries about that at all. Now, one thing that is recommended as well is when you take off like this, take the drone up a little bit, maybe 10 feet or so, and let it hover for a little while, just to make sure your satellites are there. Because if you don't have a good satellite and you go and take off, that's when you start to get toilet bowling. So make sure you have good satellites. And we can go ahead, as I showed before, we can click on it and we have 26 satellites, which is quite good. So we should have no problem at all. So let's do the functions here so we can kind of walk through those and just give you a quick view of what those look like. To open up the menu for the functions, we're going to do a person, a boat, or a vehicle, and you just draw a square on it right on the main screen, and then you'll see this little option pop up, and that's going to show us the AI QuickShots or the AI track modes. Since we're here right away, let's just do the AI QuickShots first, and you do that by clicking on it, and you'll see that there's a little arrow here on the upper right hand side, which will give you a little tutorial on how this works. This will just give you a quick little kind of a snippet of what that mode looks like. To do the pull away, we're just going to click on it here. Then over on the right, we have some parameters. We can have it return to home here, which is the little icon with the arrow in it, the return symbol. Now we can tell it how far we're going to let it fly away from us. So when you click the go, it's automatically going to record. Now that it chose me, let's just go ahead and do that. It will count down, and then it will do our function for us. And always, one thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing these types of mode is, because it's going away from you, make sure you don't have any trees or buildings that are going to be in the path, because even though it's going up and away, it could have just tagged some trees that I had here real easy. So make sure when you're doing these modes that you don't have anything in the way, because it'll fly right into them and crash. All right, and it did return, and there it is, and it stopped. Next one is the rocket mode. Let's go ahead and again, we'll do the same thing. We'll just leave it at 98 feet, and we'll do go right here on the remote. There we go. And it should keep us right in the center as it goes up and away. And there is a little timer that's on the right hand side here that lets us know what percentage that we're done. And when it's done, it should return back to the start point. And it is returning now. We're all done. Next quick shot is our circle, and it will tell us how many times we want it to orbit around us and if we want it to return to the start spot. So I think we're pretty good here. I'm going to go up just a little bit more. I don't hit this tree, and let's give that a shot. It'll count down and should circle us, no problem. Now it is very windy, so I wouldn't be surprised if it lost us a little bit, but we'll just see how it holds together. Now 70% around us, and it is looking really nice, but again, really important that you make sure that you're not going to run into any trees or buildings or things like that, because it will just kind of crash right into them. So make sure you have a good line of sight with where that drone is going to go before you launch the mode. Another mode is the spiral, which is going to spiral up and away from us here. And we'll just one time spiral and go. And the drone is definitely struggling in this wind. It's quite a bit for it, so I have to give them credit because it's really windy. So it's doing a pretty good job fighting this wind. Now from this mode, it's quite a ways up there and it did not return. So whether that's a bug that they'll fix or if that's a mode that it's going to stick with, we're going to want to make sure that we come back home manually here. Okay, and the next mode is the boomerang mode. So we're going to choose that one. Let's go ahead and we'll do one time here. And there it goes. And it did return back to where we launched here. Now for this dolly zoom, I'm going to try to run this down to a 1080p just so we can get a little more zoom, hopefully give us a little better effect with this dolly zoom. And let's go, we'll go 66 feet and go. We're going to flip this battery out. And something that I want to mention as well is if you up recording, if you weren't doing QuickShots for instance, and you press the record button like we could do right now, make sure that before you change the battery, you click that record button and stop your recording, because that will corrupt your video on the SD card. And interesting thing about how that shows up is you will see some files typically, but you just won't be able to open them. They won't show up as a video file and they'll be corrupted. And sometimes you recover them with some special software, sometimes not, but just be careful. Make sure you always make sure it's stopped recording before you turn the drone off and remove the battery. Okay, and new battery in, and always make sure that it's snapped in and the little tab popped out so you don't have any possibility of the battery popping out. I'm going to go ahead and turn our drone on, holding the button. Set it down so it can calibrate the gimbal. And just as before, you always want to make sure that you have good satellites, and you can see that we just started. Now we have 6. That's not good enough. Don't take off with that. Make sure you've got a good 14, 15, 18. Don't go up and then hope you get more satellites. That's just a recipe for spinning out of control or toilet bowling. And also, because we've already calibrated right in this spot, I'm not going to recalibrate again. So if you're in the same spot and you have a good calibration, it's been stable like it was, you don't have to recalibrate again every single time you start the drone. Just if it tells you to, certainly do it. And if you change locations, it's always just good form to do it, even if it doesn't ask you. All right, so now we're up to 24 satellites. So now we can take off, and we'll do it a little bit differently this time. We're going to hold the sticks down and in to start the props. Then we'll push the stick up to launch. There we go. And once we launch, we're going to make sure we let it hover for a little bit, just to make sure that we're good and solid with the satellites, make sure it has good position, make sure everything is all solid before we take off. So since we just did all our QuickShots, now let's do our AI tracking type modes. So let's draw a circle around me, or a little square around me. Now you see that it popped up in the AI track mode. So there's a few track modes here, and first one is our parallel track mode. And what that means is kind of like a compass. Always keep you kind of in the same place, kind of orientation with the compass. So let's go ahead and just give that a start here, and I'll show you what I mean. So you can see that it's kind of sliding south of me here. Even though I'm kind of walking backwards, it's staying in the same place regardless of where I go. So you can see that we have the drone is off to the one side here, and it's always going to stay off to that one side regardless of where we walk or what we do. So that's how it's going to track, is always kind of stay in that mode. And to cancel that mode, we're going to hit the X here. Next mode is a spotlight mode. In the spotlight mode, the drone will not move other than rotate. So it will just keep there like a kind of a camera on a pedestal and just kind of keep you in the center. So go ahead and walk around, I'll show you what I mean here. You see that the drone is always staying in the same place, and it's just kind of rotating and looking at me regardless of where I go. So if I kind of go one place, it's just going to spin in a circle. If I get farther away, I'm going to get smaller and smaller. But the drone itself is not moving position other than spinning. It's not doing any tracking or anything other than just keeping me in the center of the frame and spinning and watching me as I go. So let's stop this one by clicking the little X up here in the corner. And the last AI track mode is probably the most used mode, and that is the follow mode. It can track vehicles, boats, and people. If we walk around here, we just do go. There we go. You can see that it's going to follow me no matter where I go here. Just keeps me in the center real nice. And if we were in a vehicle, it would keep us in the center as well. It would track us real nice. So see, it does a really nice job in the shadows here, or where the dark is. I don't have any problems with it following me at all. And I did in the last video, I actually had it lose visual of me. I walked around the building here a little bit, and it didn't have any problems at all. So this does really do a really nice job as far as tracking. Now that's the end of the automated modes, and you'll notice that I didn't have any waypoints, and it is supposed to be coming. Potensic did say in a future firmware update that they were going to add the waypoints. According to Potensic, that'll be something that'll show up in the future, so we'll keep an eye out for that. And if we do get the waypoints, I'll put it out in a video just to show you that that firmware happened, and then I will give it a test just to make sure that it works. One mode we didn't talk about as well is they have something called cruise control, and cruise control is interesting if you just want to go to a specific area. Maybe you just want to take a nice video of it going real slow at a nice speed. Instead of having to hold the sticks, there's kind of a special sequence here that you can do, and we'll do it right now. Keep the recording going, and I'm going to go up here, just kind of go towards this pond a little bit here, and we're going to go slow, and I want to keep it there. You'll double click the C2 button and it will continue to go. And right now the drone is continuing to go at the same speed that I went. You notice I don't have any of the sticks held at all, but the drone is continuing to move. To stop the cruise control so it doesn't keep going and just run into a tree or go out of our visual line of sight, you can click the C2 button twice again, and that will stop the mode. And there it is, and now the drone is stopped. It quit moving, and there it is. That's how the cruise control works. So now that we stopped the recording, see that one little mode up here that looks like a little film strip, and that's going to be our camera and video modes. And if you click the camera icon, based on the settings that you have set, for instance, if you want to do a vertical picture, a 16:9, whatever it is, you can change those settings. Then when you go out, you simply can take a picture. So if you want to change the size, for instance, go down here to this little menu, pop it up, and do a widescreen view. Click, and it will take a picture. Also in this mode, we can do a panoramic mode here, and if we click on that panel, and it will build us this kind of panoramic picture. And the last one on the right is simply our video mode. And that allows us to, just like you would expect, take video, right? So anytime we want to do that, we're in the video mode. It will be in the settings that are set on the bottom of the screen here on the bottom right. And this is in the automatic mode. So we could go into the manual mode like we showed in the settings, and you could set exposure and all those things if you wanted to. Right now, we're just going to leave it in that. And if you click the button, it will be recording a video. And as I mentioned before, it's really important if you're going to change batteries or shut the drone off that you stop that recording just so you don't have any corruption of your video files. If I didn't mention it before, up on the upper right hand side there, we do have the distance away of the drone, the altitude, and the vertical and horizontal velocity if we're moving the drone around. So those parameters are up there as well. Another option is that it does have a zoom mode, and that zoom is either by the wheel, as I mentioned before. You can grab this wheel and you can see that we can zoom way in here, and that's depending upon the resolution. You can only do a 2x zoom in the 4K video, but if you drop this down to a 1080p, you'll be able to do up to a 4x zoom. So depending on the resolution you need, if you need more zoom, you can certainly do that. Just do a 1080p, for instance. There we go. Now when we click on that button, or we use the dial here to zoom, you'll notice that it goes to 4x zoom instead of 2x zoom. So if you need something with a little more zoom, that might be the way to do it, is use the 1080p. Also, I mentioned before that you could change the view down in this lower left-hand corner here. You can see where we've flown. As I mentioned, you can see that little blue line. So this is really nice if, again, you lose kind of orientation of the drone. You can see that this little arrow points in the direction of the drone. So if I turn that back towards this little blue dot, which is where we're standing and the remote is right now, we can fly back along that path, even if we kind of lose visual line of sight for a moment, just by accident, of course. But you can see it'll show us exactly where that drone is and how to get back to where we started. And a simple click will bring it back up to where we can see the view that the camera of the drone sees. And something I should have mentioned as well is that it's really important to keep this flat part of the antenna pointed towards the drone to give you the best signal. If the drone is farther away from you, kind of the normal way you hold on to the drone, it'll be pointing in the right direction. But for instance, if it's straight above you, really they want you to tip the remote almost straight up like this so that you're pointing at the drones to give you the best signal. So keep that in mind. Depending upon where you're flying, if you have some high interference or you're having some difficulties with signal, make sure the flat part of this antenna is pointed directly at the drone while you're flying for the best signal. Another mode here underneath the video section is the AI night mode, and that will normally come on automatically if it's dark out, for instance. But what this will do is we'll increase your ISO a little bit and try to apply a little bit of AI kind of noise reduction in it. So it actually does a pretty good job of actually doing that. And I did some video at night, and I'll show some of that up here while I'm talking here. So that's something that, again, it's automatic. You don't have to worry about it coming on, but if you do want to force it on, you certainly can do that. And there are two other modes that you can use for the camera mode itself as well. One is a timer, just like what it sounds like. If you click on that, you can pick how long it wants to wait. So, and that's nice if you're going to take a picture of yourself, for instance, in a group, and you want to go ahead and start the picture and then pose. It will give you a couple second countdown. Also, there's bracketing, and the bracketing is really nice if you're familiar with photography, in that you can do auto exposure bracketing, which is quite nice. So let's do this here. We're going to do a 3 bracket. We'll take a picture and show what I mean. It will actually take the exposure and go up and down with the exposure, and then stack those together so that you get kind of an HDR image. So there's our 3 pictures with the bracket. And lastly, there's a burst mode in the camera, which is kind of like it sounds like. When you take this picture, it's going to take multiple pictures in a row here, so just so you can take a burst of pictures if you'd like. And then the last thing we have in the video mode is we do have the slow motion, and what that's going to do is increase our frame rate a little bit. So if we do slow, and let's do a 5 times slow motion, and now what that will do is take it and slow it down and play it back this way, rather than us taking it and have to slow it down in post. So if we go ahead and do record on this, there we go. If we watch us go here in slow motion, I'll walk back and forth, play that back so you can see what it looks like when we do this slow motion mode. All right, so that's all we have for our flight modes here. We're going to take it back into the studio and we'll finish this video out. One of the interesting things that I found during that review of the Atom 2 was that the remote ID is transmitting all the time. Now, Potensic did reach out to me after I posted that video and said that they were going to be changing the firmware so that the remote ID only transmitted if you configured and saved it. So if you were part 107, for instance, that would work fine. But normally, unless you did that, the remote ID just wouldn't transmit. So I did take it out and test that. And when I took off, I checked it again with the Drone Scout bridge scanner just to make sure that I would see everything. And indeed, it's still transmitting the remote ID all the time. Unfortunately, that one hasn't been changed yet with this version of firmware. firmware, so apparently we'll have to wait for yet another version of firmware so that the remote ID is not transmitting all the time. Now, talking about remote ID, Potensic did reach out and let me know that the FAA did approve their declaration of compliance for the remote ID. And I did go and look, and yes, it is there. So the remote ID that's transmitting from the drone is now legal and approved by the FAA. And another thing that was interesting in the original video was that I found out that the geofencing worked a little bit differently than I thought. When I went into the zero grid airspace, it actually prevented us from flying. When I did that video, Potensic did reach out for that and said they were going to change that in the firmware. So I wanted to make sure I tested that as well. So I went to the same place in the controlled airspace in the zero grid area, and I tried to take off. This time it did not prevent me from taking off. The indication in the upper left-hand corner was green and said it was available to take off. So it will not prevent you from flying, even in a zero grid controlled airspace. One of the most common questions I get when I do a drone review is surprisingly not on the drone itself, but on the tablet and tablet holder that I use when I fly. If you've watched the videos on the channel, you'll know that I almost always use a tablet on the drone because it's so much nicer to have a little bigger picture so that you can see the telemetry and all the fine details if you're going to do some cinematic moves. Also, this particular tablet, which is the Huge Rock X7 tablet, is a super bright. It's like 2400 nits, and it's also hardened so it can withstand a little bangs or dings without cracking the screen right away. Now, this is already getting to be an old tablet from Huge Rock. It's a couple of years old, but it still works really good. I don't have any problems with any of the newer drones. It just works. It is an Android-based tablet, and it makes a big difference from a regular tablet. And to show an example of that, I just walked outside right now, and I set up all of these with the exact same picture with all of these devices, a regular Samsung tablet, my Samsung phone, and the Huge Rock X7 tablet. And I turned all the brightnesses to maximum, and they all are displaying the exact same telemetry picture from a drone. So with the sun on it, even at a nice angle or shrouded, you can see the picture in the Huge Rock tablet up in the corner, but in the regular Samsung tablet or on the phone, it's barely visible that there's even anything there at all. If you were outside and had a little sunshade, because I know some people like to use those, and that does make a little bit of a difference, but there's no comparison when you're truly trying to fly and seeing what you're doing to having a super bright tablet. If you're serious about flying, it's an investment that's going to last you a long time. Like I said, this one I've already had for over 2 years, and it does a great job. It just works every day. I turn it on, it has great power, so it's a great investment for the long haul. Now, the next piece, of course, is then the tablet mount itself, and I'll show a couple different ones, and I'll explain why I use 2 different ones. So for a remote like the Potensic like this, it has this little kind of pinch kind of mount for the devices. A tablet won't fit in there directly, so you have to use some type of a mount. Now, one of the ones you can use is this one here from Amazon, and I'll put links in the description. And this is really quite good for a basic mount. So what it does is it gives you this little plate here that will kind of fit into the remote itself like this, so it'll pop right in there. So overall, it's in there pretty good. And a lot of times I'll stick my thumbs on the sides like this if I want to just make sure if I'm moving around to not pop it out. But overall, it's pretty decent if you're just sitting here. That will work even with the Huge Rock tablet. Now, this one is a little different in that if you put the Huge Rock tablet in there, it won't fit just dropping in like this. But what you can do is actually turn this sideways like so. Then the Huge Rock tablet is small enough where it fits in this way and actually grabs the ends. Now, that's nice because the cable will come out of the remote here and come out and go right into the bottom of the drone. So it'll connect real nice there. There's nothing in the way. So that's a nice little connection for the cable then as well. You can use the regular cable that come with the drone and then just attach this little extender to it. And it works just fine. Pretty much I've had it on every drone and it works fine. One of the reasons I use a different mount is one, I had a different type of mount from another drone. So I used it because I had it around instead of buying another one. Now I did modify it by taking this mount and I took the other top part off. I drilled and tapped a hole in it. And then I used the X7 mounts to connect it. Now the reason I use the X7 mounts is one, they're really nice. The X7 mount here is really very high quality. It does not come with the X7 itself. It is an extra accessory, but you can see this thing, it is a pretty impressive mount with all that it comes with. But this is multi-purpose as well. So first of all, just to show that this will connect to the Huge Rock here, this actually has screws that screw in to this mount. So you're not going to worry about it popping off of there because when it goes down in here, there's actual screws that screw right into the mount itself from the top and from the bottom, so it's really in there. You're not going to have to worry about this thing falling out of there for sure. And it's the same type of mount then as the other mount, in that it will just slide right in to the Potensic mount. And as I mentioned, there's another reason that I got the whole mount instead of using this other one from Amazon. And that is that with this kit comes one little adapter here. And this little adapter is nice because if you have any DJI drones, for instance, and you have a remote that looks like this with these little kind of bars on it, this is made to fit directly on there. And it is so nice because it pops right on. This little piece here screws right into this mount. And because it's so versatile, I can loosen this up and I can put this tablet mount here kind of wherever I want it. So if I want this to be a little bit different here, and now I have a really nice tablet mount for a DJI type mount like this as well. So this is the tablet that I use for all of my drone flying, and that's why. So hopefully that is useful to you and answers your question on the tablet and the tablet mounts. So this was one of the longest videos, or I would say probably the longest video that I have ever done. So I hope it was useful to you because it was an awful lot of work. And if it was helpful in any way or you learned something new, take a second and click that like button. I really appreciate it. So don't forget that all of the information we talked about here is in the chapters. Feel free to bookmark this and come back to it as you need. And of course, if you have questions, always ask in the comments. Happy to help if I can. So with that, we'll see you in the next video. And until then, good flying.